Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or even good night, depending on the time zone in which you are. On behalf of my colleagues and co-coordinators, Diana Mendez, Pedro Urquijo, Alfredo Pureco, Timothy Lorek, and Antonio Chamorro, I welcome you to the Interinstitutional Global Seminar on Green Revolution, an academic space supported by the Colegio Mexiquense, the Dr. José María Luis Mora Research Institute, and the Environmental Geography Research Center of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. It is an honor to have you here at this 13th session of the Global Seminar on Green Revolution 80 years later. On this occasion, we will have the opportunity to hear the presentations of three magnificent panelists about the Green Revolution in the United States. So this session will be moderated by the Professor Timothy Lorek, whom I'm pleased to introduce to all yourself. Tim Lorek is Assistant Professor, History and Director of the Program in Sustainability and Justice at the College of Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. He researches and writes about environmental issues, the history of agriculture, science, and politics, and international collaboration and exchange, particularly related to Colombia, Puerto Rico, in the United States. His work has won awards and been supported by fellowships from Albright, the Rockefeller Cat Center, the New York Botanical Garden, the American Historical Association, the American Society for Environmental History, Agricultural History Society, and the Natural Endowment for the Humanities. Well, I will give the floor to the Professor Lorek. So go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Netza. Thank you, Diana, and the other organizers. And thank you to Amy, Helen, and Tori for joining us today. The way this is going to work today is that we will hear from our three panelists. I will introduce each one as we go. Each one will speak for approximately 15 to 18 minutes maximum. And then we will open the floor for a discussion. I will initiate with a few brief questions to help get us started and then moderate a discussion with the rest of the panelists. Feel free to submit questions in the chat box, and Diana, Netza, and I, the other organizers, will all make sure that your questions are received. Okay, so we are going to go in the order on the poster today. So we will begin with Amy Offner. Amy C. Offner is Associate Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Sorting Out the Mixed Economy, The Rise and Fall of Welfare and Developmental States in the Americas, soon to be published in Spanish translation by the Editorial Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. She is currently working on two projects, a history of debt among Native Americans in the 20th century United States, and The Disappearing Worker, a new title which will explore the unraveling of the employment relationship since 1945. Amy, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, for that introduction. And thank you to all three of you, Netza, Diana, and Tim, for the invitation to be here today. Let me see if I can share my screen. Well, something is going wrong with Zoom on my computer, and rather than subject you all to ongoing issues, I'll do my best just to talk through my presentation today with apologies. We're having some technical issues in the building that I'm in right now. I'm going to be speaking today about research that I did for a book that I published a few years ago called Sorting Out the Mixed Economy. And honestly, I really appreciate being invited here because I really didn't think that I was writing about the Green Revolution when I wrote this book. And so I'm kind of curious to hear how this conversation develops and to sort of see how I fit into it. In one part of the book, I explored the history of land reform in Colombia during the 1960s. And what I thought I was doing at the time was not trying to explore the Green Revolution at all, but I was trying to challenge what I perceived as a common form of memory of land reform laws that tended to reduce them in retrospect, simply to programs that promised progressive redistribution of land. And I was interested in other things that land reform laws also did in the 20th century, including consolidate agribusiness in some cases, and also contribute to the popularization of economic reasoning. I thought that they played an interesting role in producing the kind of world that we live in today, where everyone argues in economic terms, even though people don't actually agree on what the substantive content of economics is. So part of this research had to do with the way that policies that on the one hand did promise redistribution could also consolidate agribusiness. And to the extent that policies consolidating agribusiness can be conceptualized under the rubric of the Green Revolution, I hope that this research has something to say today. And I should say that I think of my book in many ways as just kind of background to Tim's book. I mean, Tim has actually written about the Green Revolution, not just in Columbia, but in the exact place that my research was studying. And so I am really looking forward to this conversation. So in 1961, Columbia passed a land reform law, not its first, but the one that I study. It passed a land reform law that helped to make the country a showcase of the Alliance for Progress, which of course was an anti-communist development program created by the United States and partner governments in Latin America to combat the example of the Cuban Revolution. The 1961 land reform law was supposed to be a model anti-Cuban land reform. It was supposed to demonstrate to Latin Americans that you could achieve redistribution and economic justice under capitalism. The land reform law in Colombia eventually became one of the great fiascos of the Alliance for Progress. It failed to redistribute property in any significant measure, and it really discredited mid-century anti-communist reform. When I was doing my research, I was struck by the way that this law was remembered in Colombia. Public discussion of it, and also a good deal of historical research, presented a very consistent explanation of the law's failure. Supposedly, redistribution had been slow going during the 1960s. It was hindered by landowner resistance and competing government commitments. And then the effort met its death in the 1970s when the government withdrew its support and gutted the law. What I found, though, was that in southwestern Colombia, something very different had happened. My research focused on the Cauca Valley, which was and still is one of the most fertile agricultural regions in all of Latin America. And what I found was that there, land reform failed to redistribute property, not because landowners obstructed it, but because they captured it and they used it for entirely different ends. The 1961 land reform law in the Cauca Valley became an instrument to raise productivity at the expense of equality. Land reform provided the financing, the legal authority, and the ideological legitimacy to displace campesinos and expand agribusiness. The process of implementing the law, in turn, had ideological consequences. It transformed the reasoning that large landowners used. It taught them to embrace the drive for productivity as a way of defending themselves from redistribution. I thought that this local history mattered for a couple of different reasons. First, I thought that it brought Colombia, a supposedly exceptional country, into kind of wider conversations in Latin American history. All throughout Latin America, land reform laws of the 20th century enshrined commitments to two separate goals: productivity and redistribution. And the question everywhere was how these two goals might relate to each other and who would determine their priority when they came into conflict. I think that the Cauca Valley was just one place where productivity ultimately took priority over redistribution. And I think that there's good evidence that this was a common dynamic in other parts of Colombia and other parts of Latin America as well. The second reason that this story interested me was that the process by which landowners prevented redistribution in the 60s shows what land reform did accomplish, what did change in this period. If the distribution of land didn't really change, what changed was actually the arguments and reasoning of large landowners. The land reform law helped to popularize forms of economic reasoning. The emergence of economic argument as a persuasive and even essential part of public life occurred all across the world in the 20th century. And in the Cauca Valley, ultimately, I really came to the conclusion that land reform had been a fairly useless instrument for redistributing wealth, but it had been a highly effective instrument for transforming the terms in which capitalists express their interests. So let me try and sort of tell this story in miniature. The Cauca Valley is, of course, a river valley that's nestled between the western and central cordilleras of the Andes. And this was home of a public agency called the Cauca Valley Corporation, or the CVC. And understanding that institution is quite central to understanding what happens with the land reform law. The CVC was established in 1954 as a for-profit public enterprise that was responsible for raising productivity in the Cauca Valley. The corporation carried out flood control, land reclamation, hydroelectric power production, and it did all of these things in order to facilitate the expansion of industry and intensive agriculture. The CVC's leaders were themselves large industrialists and landowners, and they received strong backing from the World Bank, the US State Department, and an array of foreign advisors, most famously among them David Lilienthal, who was the former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States, an iconic New Deal agency. They also received support from the economist Albert Hirschman. During the mid-1950s, the CVC and its allies, they forced the Colombian government to devolve an extraordinary set of public powers to the corporation. And they popularized the idea that development programs required state decentralization, which in their moment meant first, devolving national government powers to a regional entity. And it also, second, meant placing public powers in the hands of private businessmen and actually remaking public enterprise in the image of the private sector corporation. At the time of the corporation's founding, the CVC's leaders were a rather exceptional minority among the Cauca Valley's large landowners, most of whom were not especially interested in raising productivity, and they definitely didn't agree on what measures would be necessary to do so. The executive director of the CVC, whose name was Bernardo Garcés Córdoba, he clearly explained the corporation's commitments. He had been educated at McGill and the Fletcher School of Diplomacy, and was one of the very few Colombians to have earned a BA in economics, actually, before 1945. He looked at the Cauca Valley and he just saw squandered resources everywhere. The fertile flatlands that lay between the mountains could produce just an enormous variety of fruits and vegetables. But he says, they're cluttered with cattle ranches and small holdings. So Garcés offered a very simple solution. He proposed to banish livestock into the mountains and turn campesinos into wage workers, and meanwhile to reclaim the valley's rich soil for intensive commercial agriculture, producing fruits and vegetables. According to Garcés, economic productivity was intimately related to the well-being of all Colombians. Cattle ranchers engaged in extensive cattle ranching, and minifundistas growing a combination of subsistence and cash crops. They, in his view, were just obstructing cultivation that could feed people at lower cost, it could create jobs, it could boost exports, and it could generate foreign exchange to finance industrialization. So seen from this perspective, the pursuit of productivity became an ethical obligation. A person who was using a valuable resource to achieve any other end was, in his view, either selfish or just ignorant. Garcés indeed took a very dim view of most of the landowners, workers, and campesinos in the Cauca Valley. He complained that they had, quote, no training, no initiative, no sense of responsibility. These are his words. So transforming agricultural production, in his view, would require transforming the people of the Cauca Valley. He wanted to provide education and incentives to make people in the Cauca Valley embrace productivity as a goal. Garcés certainly decried the ignorance and complacency of most landowners, what he saw as their ignorance and complacency, but he was not all by himself. He wasn't a voice in the wilderness. In 1957, the CVC launched a pilot land reclamation project in the northern part of Valle, the department of Valle del Cauca. And it envisioned this project as the first of many that would culminate in massive dam construction along the Cauca River, making the entire valley fit for intensive agriculture. As the CVC embarked on its first projects in the 1950s, it immediately, though, faced two problems. First, it did not have nearly enough money. And second, large landowners in many parts of the valley were actually trying to abolish the CVC itself. The agricultural and cattlemen's associations in Valle launched a national propaganda campaign, claiming that the CVC had appropriated national powers that it had no right to wield. They took advantage of the fact that the CVC had in fact been created during the brief military dictatorship of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla in the 1950s. Although the CVC's leaders had actually been rather fierce opponents of the military government by the end, the agricultores and the ganaderos depicted the corporation as a vestige of the dictatorship. And they said that it was anathema to what they called Colombian democratic postulates. So they argue against the corporation in expressly political terms. The period of land reform in the 1960s was significant then because first, it rescued the CVC's struggling initiatives of the 1950s. The CVC's leaders insinuated themselves into the Alliance for Progress, first by shaping the land reform itself. The law was written by national politicians who admired the CVC. They saw it as a model initiative, and they fundamentally agreed that Colombia had to increase agricultural productivity. The law did promote redistribution because both Colombian and US officials believed that they had to give campesinos some land to restore the legitimacy of government during a period of social and political crisis, which Colombia was certainly going through in this moment. But the law also contained articles that protected large landowners from redistribution if they used their land productively and if they paid taxes for drainage and irrigation works. And that had been an explicit demand of the CVC, which argued that landowners would never agree to invest in land reclamation works if they might soon lose their property. The CVC immediately availed itself of the land reform law. It secured funds from the law to finance its existing program of land reclamation and intensification. And it also secured actually the authority to formally administer the law in the Cauca Valley. Throughout the 1960s, the corporation then used the law's provisions protecting productively used lands in order to shield landowners from expropriation as long as they complied with land reclamation measures to raise productivity. Meanwhile, large landowners themselves subdivided their properties amongst themselves and they shuffled them among relatives to place them outside the law's reach. Technically, nobody owned quite enough land in order to be subject to compensated expropriation. So large landowners evaded expropriation in the Cauca Valley. The people who actually lost their land under the 1961 law were almost exclusively the poorest people in the region, farmers who had virtually no land at all. Land reform became a program of massive displacement that was designed to eliminate what the CVC called anti-economic farms, meaning those smaller than 3 hectares. Because the CVC and the National Land Reform Institute, INCORA, refused to break up most large properties, they acknowledged that there wasn't enough land available to resettle all of those dispossessed minifundistas. And in any case, they had no intention of relocating most of the people they displaced. They justified their decision by arguing that new intensive agriculture would support a larger wage labor force. And they implied that through dispossession, land reform would create that agrarian working class. We know that dispossession has been a chronic problem in 20th century Colombian history. And in this particular context, dispossession and displacement was an affirmative state project to transform the rural class structure. Depriving poor people of land and making them into displaced persons was actually a deliberate policy that gave former minifundistas no option but to depend entirely on wage labor. The book explores protest and resistance by smallholders, and it also argued that the enactment of land reform had a big effect on landowners themselves. The fact that land reform was a productivity strategy fundamentally and not a redistributive one transformed the nature of landowners' reasoning. It taught old organizations of landowners in the Cauca Valley to defend their interests in dramatically new ways. Landowner associations, you'll remember, had attacked the corporation, the CVC, in stark political terms in the 1950s. They said it was a vestige of dictatorship. It was contrary to democracy. And they now, in the 1960s, started to embrace the drive for productivity as a new way of defending themselves from expropriation. In 1963, the agricultores and ganaderos joined with Valle's sugar growers, a large and influential group of capitalists, to promote a plan to expand sugarcane cultivation and build 4 new mills to process the sugar. The plan promised to expand employment. It promised to give Colombia an export crop that didn't need trade protection, and it promised to bring in foreign exchange. The landowner groups insisted, though, that sugar had to be grown in large extensions. You couldn't redistribute land and grow sugar. So the sugar plan, as it was called, reflected a shift in the way that large landowners defended their hold on property. Rather than do things they had done in the 1950s, like cast their opponents as politically illegitimate or just threaten violence, which was another strategy they had used in the 50s, they presented themselves as advocates of production and contributors to national macroeconomic goals. This form of argument gained strength over the 1960s as landowners became increasingly habituated to the terms of the land reform law. By the end of the decade, landowner organizations were independently producing literature opposing redistribution through appeals to productivity. And I could provide examples, but for the sake of time, I'll skip over that. The point here is that over the course of the 1960s, the CVC had developed a formula to domesticate land reform and turn it into a productivity strategy that allowed it to broker a kind of modus vivendi between large landowners and a reformist state. Taxation and private investment in production, both calibrated to guarantee sizable profits for landowners, became the routine costs of maintaining large land holdings. Expropriation had very little real application in the Cauca Valley. Instead, the threat of expropriation served to drive landowners to invest productively and advance national macroeconomic goals. So land reform, as a result, just redistributed very little property in the Cauca Valley, and most people who lost their farms were extremely poor to begin with. The Colombian and US policymakers who backed the law embraced both redistribution and productivity, although they didn't assign equal importance to both of them, and some didn't even consider the two goals to be compatible. Over the course of the decade, with businessmen directing the implementation of the law, Colombia's land reform law became an increasingly effective instrument to expand production at the expense of equality. For those who sought capitalist development characterized by economic growth, productive investment by the wealthy, and the creation of paying jobs for the poor, the land reform law was not actually a lost opportunity. It was a success. For those who sought redistribution and security for small farmers, it was a perversion of reform, and that's the version we tend to remember today. The leaders of the CVC, in turn, made the law an instrument to create consensus around the value of productivity among large landowners who had quite violently disagreed on the subject during the 1950s. Land reform transformed Cauca Valley's old landowner organizations. It taught them to defend inequality using relatively simple economic arguments that the law recognized. Landowners learned to legitimate concentrated wealth by arguing that their investments contributed to productivity and national economic development. And so I see land reform as a social process through which landowners came to reason about social and ethical issues using economic claims. To today's theme of the Green Revolution, this is also a history, I think, that kind of defies what remains somewhat popular memories of land reform as kind of the pure antecedent to the Green Revolution. Colombia's 1961 land reform contained competing commitments within it, and the question was who was going to have the power to interpret and administer it. I think that Colombia's developmental state systematically devolved power to private and regional entities, and in the Cauca Valley, that mode of governance put capitalists in a position to administer the law for their own purposes. So thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Amy. That was a really great introduction to themes of capitalism and land and wage labor. We'll come back to all of those things, no doubt. We're going to move along to our next speaker. Dr. Helen Ann Curry is Melvin Kranzberg Professor in the History of Technology at the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology, and an honorary senior research fellow at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, University of Cambridge. She's the author of Evolution Made to Order, Plant Breeding and Technological Innovation in 20th Century America, Chicago Press, 2016, and Endangered Maize, Industrial Agriculture and the Crisis of Extinction, California, 2022. She's also co-editor with, me, of Agricultural Science as International Development Historical Perspectives on the CGIAR Era, which is forthcoming with Cambridge. Helen, you're up.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And it is such a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to the organizers of this seminar. I've very much learned a lot from taking part in and hearing the presentations in earlier sessions. And I'm truly delighted to be sharing some of my own recent research as part of this ongoing conversation. Trying to share my screen here. I think that was probably not the right one to do. Hang on just one second. There we go. Let's see if I can do this better. Apologies. There we are. Oop, not that. Have we got it? No. Hang on one second.
That looks good, Helen.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the confirmation. Great. So the research that I'm going to share today is work that connects or starts to connect the history of what I think of as the kind of small g, small r Green Revolution in the United States Corn Belt in the early part of the 20th century to the mid 20th century, to what we might think of as the capital G, capital R Green Revolution in India and Mexico and beyond later on in the 20th century. And the work that I'm presenting today really tries to do this through looking at the history of extension, which is maybe not as fully explored as a part of Green Revolution histories as it might be. So I'm going to look at two well-known to agreed to be influential instances of extension work that I think are associated with these agricultural transformations. So here we go. The first of those will be the promotion of good practices in seed corn selection and care in the United States Midwest in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, illustrated here with the example of the seed corn gospel train, which I'll talk a bit more about. And the second is the development and the dissemination of materials by US-led institutions for use in training agricultural development workers across different country contexts. And that'll be illustrated here with the example of the text Getting Agriculture Moving, which has been described as the software of the Green Revolution. So the seed corn gospel and the software of the Green Revolution share in the same intellectual and cultural history of agricultural extension. And there are multiple different histories that tell that general story of continuity, and also which cover some of the specifics that I'm going to talk about today. What's potentially unique about my work here is uniting these through a particular connection. You'll see in the picture on the left of the corn seed gospel train, the man holding up the germination box demonstrating elements of seed care. His name was Martin Mosher, and he was an Iowa State or Iowa County agricultural extension agent. And Martin Mosher was the father of Arthur T. Mosher, who is the author of Getting Agriculture Moving. And what I'm interested in looking at these two individuals is their shared commitment to agricultural extension, especially education and adaptation of tools to local circumstances as key instruments of rural change. So I'll start with Martin Mosher. Martin Mosher's career in agricultural extension began in 1905 when he was invited to serve as a lecturer on the so-called seed corn special while he was in the midst of finishing his degree at the Iowa State Agricultural College. The seed corn special or corn gospel train was a traveling extension program. It brought instructions on seed care to farmers across the state of Iowa via a classroom rail car. So basically, it kind of delivered the good news, in this case of good farming, via train, much like enterprising evangelists were doing via so-called chapel cars around the same time. In 1905, which was the year that Mosher participated in the seed corn special, it visited some 600 Iowa towns. At each stop that the train made, the extension instructors invited farmers, like the ones you see here, on board the train car to listen to lectures about selecting seeds, about testing the quality of corn seeds, planting them correctly, and so on. Now, in 1906, after his graduation from the Iowa State Agricultural College, Mosher was hired back to lead what were called county farm demonstrations for what was then the brand new Iowa State Department of Extension. So this was the moment of the institutionalization of agricultural extension in Iowa and subsequently across the United States. So in his role, Mosher traveled from county to county across the state of Iowa, conducting demonstrations that were meant to educate farmers in good practices of farming through their own experiences and observations. And of the several demonstrations that Mosher routinely carried out, there were about 4 of them. Of the demonstrations, he considered what was called the farmer's variety test to be the most important one. So this test was a multi-month demonstration in which different farmers' seeds were gathered and grown in a single plot, where then they received all the same care. And the main purpose of this demonstration was to show farmers the variable quality of the corn seeds that different farmers were planting from one farm to the next, and to encourage all farmers to really take much better care in selecting which seeds they wanted to use, selecting them from the plants on their own farm from season to season, that is, storing them over the winter, and then the methods that they would use for planting them. These demonstrations also gradually reshaped Mosher's advice to farmers on selecting corn seeds. And that's because the data that was generated in the repetition of the farmer's variety test and other demonstrations really started to make him and others aware of the extent to which some farmers' varieties were just more productive than other farmers. And this in turn suggested that agents like Mosher would be much more effective in their efforts to convince farmers about change and increase seed quality across counties and across the state if they were also taking steps to distribute seeds of any varieties that the farmers' variety tests were revealing to be more productive. This was hard to do when one had responsibility for farms across the state, but in 1912, Mosher became the Clinton County Agricultural Advisor. And in that role, he was Iowa's first ever county level agricultural extension agent. And working at the county level was to become the norm across the country. So Mosher took the opportunity of having a more geographically circumscribed position to integrate his corn demonstrations, integrate into them a system for seed production. In 1913, he launched the Clinton County Corn Yield Test. And in this test, he began with the typical farmer's variety test, collecting and featuring varieties that were saved and maintained by farmers in that county from season to season. And after the first year of tests, he then repeated it a second year and a third year using seeds from those same farmers in each of the subsequent seasons. And the farmer's seed that was highest yielding across the 3 years that he ran the test was then multiplied by a local farmer, and it was made available to other farmers to purchase across that county. So this program, which, as I've said, was orchestrated by Mosher, actually ended up transforming the composition of local cornfields, at least according to reports from that period of time. By the early 1920s, an estimated 75% of farmers in the county were raising this winning strain of corn, which had originated with a farmer named A.H. Studeman. And the influence of the Clinton County Corn Yield Test didn't stop at the county borders. Mosher was soon recruited to another county, this time in Illinois, a county named Woodford County. And he was hired there chiefly for the purpose of carrying out this exact same process, again, with the farmers of this new space. So between 1919 and 1922, the Woodford County Corn Test identified the corn grown by a farmer named George Krug as far and away the best among the seeds that farmers in that region were using. And the arrangements that Mosher made to distribute the winning seed caused Krug's corn to spread just as rapidly as the Studeman corn had spread in Clinton County, Iowa. So according to Mosher, it was within a decade the most generally grown of any single strain in an area from 50 to 100 miles wide across the south central part of the Corn Belt. So it had really kind of taken off from being something that just one farmer grew to something grown by many more. Now, back in Iowa, the Clinton County test is said to have encouraged the institution of a statewide corn yield test, so comparing varieties across the entire state. And this was first held in 1920, thanks especially to Henry Wallace, who had, among other notable achievements, once lived in the same house as Martin Mosher. He, of course, as many here will know, later became the Secretary of Agriculture of the United States, eventually the vice president, and it was influential, as perhaps Tori will tell us, in setting up the Mexican agriculture program of the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, the Iowa corn yield test began as a key site for advertising the best of farm-saved, open-pollinated varieties, the same kind that the farmers Mosher worked with were using, but it very soon became a vehicle for testing and showcasing the best F1 hybrid varieties as well. And once hybrids began consistently outperforming open-pollinated varieties, the Iowa corn yield test served basically as a kind of de facto demonstration to farmers of why they ought to be paying annually for a seed company to provide them with a supply of hybrid seeds. So I've moved through a trajectory of Mosher and these corn yield tests very quickly, but I want to emphasize what I see as the key legacies of Martin Mosher's corn seed demonstrations to farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and beyond. So one key legacy, I think, is the ever wider spread, facilitating the ever wider spread of a select few strains of corn across the Corn Belt, even in the period prior to the introduction of hybrid corn. And then second, the launch of a very effective advertising strategy for a seed industry that, as many others have written, de-skilled farmers in the mechanics of seed selection and seed care. And these outcomes, which I think are outcomes that we associate with agricultural transformation to industrial agriculture, are ironic, I think, in the case of Mosher, given that his demonstrations were ostensibly originally meant to illustrate, first, the rewards to farmers of their attentiveness to seed care, and then second, the value of locally adapted varieties. And I can talk more about both of those as having been aims, but those were clearly part of his original agenda. So I think we might summarize this as a story in which localized extension focused on expanding individual farmers' knowledge and agency, ultimately served other ends, even in the short run. And I'll come back to that at the end, why I think that's important. But I want to first conclude on Martin Mosher by offering a summary of his vision of extension, a vision which comes from a 1935 letter that he wrote to his son, Arthur, who I'm going to turn to in just a moment. In that letter, Martin described for Arthur what he called a 5-pointed program for agricultural progress, in which new knowledge emerging from research, education of many people in that knowledge, application of that knowledge as a result of education by farmers, the measure of performance made by extension workers of farmers' application of knowledge on their farms, and then distribution of whatever is measured at best or most fruitful. So this was basically a model in which the expert knowledge of the agricultural research community was to be tested and negotiated on local farms, and only then disseminated through extension activities. And I think it's clear that this maps onto or was derived from Mosher's corn demonstrations experiences. I'll also add that I think from a 21st century perspective, we might consider Martin's 5-pointed program his software for extension, something that he saw as able to be run in different contexts in order to produce a desired set of outcomes. Right, so we've learned about Martin Mosher and his legacy. I want to now turn to his son, Arthur. In 1933, Arthur Mosher departed for India. At that time, he had just finished his undergraduate degree. He had been confused about whether he wanted to be a farmer or a pastor or a politician, and had learned about the possibility of becoming an agricultural missionary and applied for a position on the staff of the Allahabad Agricultural Institute in India. This institute, which had been founded in 1910 by the English-born Presbyterian missionary Sam Higginbottom, aimed to share so-called scientific farming practices with Indian farmers. And Mosher was hired to serve there as an agricultural engineer. Now, by his own retrospective accounting, Arthur Mosher was really quickly dissatisfied with his job, to an extent dissatisfied with the Institute as a whole. He was teaching classes that were based on the technologies and ecologies and policies that he'd learned as an agricultural student in Illinois. But Indian farming was clearly very different from that context. And he soon expressed an interest in establishing an extension program at the Allahabad Institute that would be tailored to local conditions. So what did Arthur Mosher go on to do? Well, here I have to say that I'm very grateful to Prakash Kumar for the work that he's done on the history of the Allahabad Agricultural Institute and the place of Mosher's work and vision within it. I don't have time to do justice to that story today, and I want to refer folks here to his work on that subject. As he's described for the history of development work in India more generally, Prakash has noted that in the 1940s and later, an early pattern of engaging individual farmers with an emphasis on self-reliance gave way to thinking in terms of infrastructure creation and group change, right? This shift from, for those familiar with the kind of US history with a kind of country life model, again, this sort of self-reliance, to the more Cold War model that I think many of us are perhaps more familiar with. So in his excellent account of these changes in Americans' ambitions for Indian cultivators, Prakash Kumar calls out Arthur Mosher as someone whose career really embodied this shift in a lot of ways, in particular as he reshaped his vision for the Allahabad Agricultural Institute's extension work, specifically in response to the interests of the Ford Foundation and other funders in comparatively huge community development initiatives. So rather than cover the details of that story again, I want to skip ahead in the narrative to 1958, which is when Arthur Mosher, who'd come back to the United States and had been working since 1952 as an expert in comparative international agricultural extension programs, was hired to be the executive director of the Agricultural Development Council, or ADC. The ADC was a philanthropy founded by John D. Rockefeller III in order to address concerns about population growth in Asia. And he saw a means of doing so chiefly in promoting agricultural economic research and training. And perhaps this story of agricultural economics is one place where my history connects back to the story that Amy has just told us a few moments ago. So among the most influential of the ADC's program was an initiative called the Training Materials Project. And the basic idea of this, which was initially formulated by Arthur Mosher, was to address a perceived lack of educational materials for training agricultural workers in Asia, especially those who were employees of state agricultural agencies like ministries of agriculture. And the most influential outcome of this work, I think by far, was Mosher's 1966 book, Getting Agriculture Moving. And I'm going to quote here from the sociologist Ben White's excellent summary of the book's contents as, quote, a well-organized overview of the problems of smallholder farm management and the steps and policies necessary to bring smallholders into the world of commercial intensified farming using purchased inputs on the Green Revolution model, all expressed in easy-to-read language. Now, this audience will, of course, know that the declaration of a Green Revolution was still 2 years in the future at the time Getting Agriculture was published, Getting Agriculture Moving was published. But that rather than raise suspicion about White's claims, I think this only confirms that it was in circulation in time to be part of some of the transformations that would come to be described as the Green Revolution. And to give you a sense of the scale here, 13,000 copies of Getting Agriculture Moving were distributed within a year, 60,000 by 1973. It appeared in a simplified edition, of which at least 25,000 copies were circulated in this early period of its publication. It was translated into at least 17 languages, and perhaps more than that. The foundation really encouraged its free translation. As White summarizes, in many Asian countries during the early years of the Green Revolution, it was easily the most widely available and read book, and by far the most influential book on agriculture and rural development to be circulated. And this is really the justification for his characterization of it as the software of the Green Revolution. And I would just add that perhaps an equally apt metaphor, given its author's training as a missionary, might also be the gospel of the Green Revolution, but we can think about those metaphors more later. Now, I think the evocation of software is meant to suggest that getting agriculture moving was meant to program people and institutions to follow a particular pathway of agricultural change. And indeed, it was in some ways, not least in being structured around the vision of moving farmers from quote unquote primitive to scientific agriculture with very specific notions of what constituted scientific. Yet it was also inflected with Mosher's continuing understanding of agriculture as something that would have to be profoundly local in its nature. Recall that he had wanted to develop an extension program that was specific to the region around the Allahabad Institute. And getting agriculture moving and the training materials that accompanied it often emphasized that training would have to be adapted to local circumstances, using case studies that would be relevant to the region, data that was produced and gathered from local sources. So it was a framework for training and not a textbook in agricultural methods, or even in specific lessons from agriculture and from economic and social sciences, as those would have to be site specific. So a slightly whirlwind presentation, but hopefully some of this notion of the vision of getting agriculture moving and Arthur Mosher's views on extension have come across. And I want to offer some concluding thoughts that hopefully tie these together. So I think many of you will recognize ways in which this story is one that revisits existing accounts that show how visions of agricultural modernization forged in the US Midwest around hybrid corn ultimately undermined privatization and consolidation in the seed industry. And then how these and related US-born visions and outcomes were circulated and in many cases imposed on farmers overseas. So I want to be clear about my agenda vis-a-vis that story, since I really see myself as joining up with the growing chorus of revision, including by my colleagues here on this panel and others who participated in this seminar, to accounts of I want to contribute to the revision of accounts of a seemingly singular US-dominated trajectory of agricultural modernization. I think, as we know from this incredibly rich new body of scholarship that's been emerging, modernization meant different things to different actors. It was sought as well as imposed. It was negotiated and contested. Not least, even foreign imposed modernization programs were built up or in some cases grew out of local institutions and knowledge. And with this more variegated Green Revolution historiography in mind, what I'm interested in about the Moshers is that I don't see them as having tried to sell or provide blanket solutions as the histories that we have of agriculture based around universalized, widely adapt seeds or technological packages so often suggest to us. I think from the materials that I've read so far, and there's certainly more to discover, they didn't appear to even believe those kinds of solutions existed. What they were committed to were processes of education and adaptation. Yet at the same time, each of them participated in historical events that are routinely pinpointed as key moments in which diverse trajectories of agricultural growth and change were eventually shut down and effectively shut down, and universalized solutions were imposed. And I think this is as much a lesson for our collective process of thinking a way out of the Green Revolution as it's been developed and circulated and imposed in different places around the world, as much as it is one of also re-understanding and analyzing its history. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. That we'll have a lot to discuss with your concluding remarks. So let's move on to our third presenter today. Tori Olsson is a historian of the United States and an associate professor at the University of Tennessee. His first book, Agrarian Crossings, Reformers, and the Remaking of the US and Mexican Countryside from 2017, explored the entangled histories of agricultural development in the US and Mexico, with the Green Revolution as a crucial component. Since his first book, he has grown more interested in pop culture and its intersection with serious history should have been in quotation marks. His second book, out in summer 2024, is titled Red Dead's History, A Video Game, an Obsession, and America's Violent Past, and is aimed primarily at non-academic readers. He's also working on a third book titled The Global Cowboy, American Country Music's Unlikely Travels Around the World. Tori.
Great. Good morning or afternoon or evening to everybody. Thank you so much, Tim, for the kind introduction, and tremendous thanks to Diana, Netza, and Antonio for the invitation to participate in this session. It's so great to see Amy and Helen as well. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. And what I really love about this seminar series is the really wide diversity of perspectives that different scholars bring to the single big topic of the Green Revolution, whatever that might be. Now, I'm trained primarily as a US historian, which means I bring my own strange perspective, to be sure. And I first learned about the Green Revolution about 15 years ago, when I was a graduate student, when I was preparing for my comprehensive exams, this big milestone in graduate training. And my primary field at the time was in US history, but I also had secondary fields in Latin American history and in global food history. And it was in those two non-US lists where I first encountered this phrase, Green Revolution. I really hadn't heard it before. It was about 2009 or so when I had my first encounter with this topic. And in reading those books and articles for comps, I really came face to face with what was then the standard critical account that was pretty dominant at the time. I learned from these books and articles that the Green Revolution was fundamentally a story about the misguided Americanization of global agriculture. As most of these histories told, the Green Revolution was born from Cold War anxieties in the 1940s with the Rockefeller Foundation as a key architect. It started in Mexico in 1943, all right, well, of course, the year which we're now commemorating with the 80th anniversary highlighted in this series, and then spread virally outwards. And as almost all these books and articles argued, with disastrous consequences for small-scale agriculture and for the environment. Now, in all of these studies, they indicated that the US was the guiding hand that was pushing and driving the Green Revolution, but very few of these accounts gave any indication that the Green Revolution was something that actually had happened within the United States. Instead, nearly all claimed that the Green Revolution was a natural outgrowth of US success, wealth, and productivity, particularly in the US Midwest. It was somewhat as if the Green Revolution was a process marked for export only, that it had never really been undertaken in the US because it wasn't needed and was therefore only applicable to poor rural nations in the so-called Third World. So this was the story of the Green Revolution that I was learning from my Latin American and global food history books. Now, this notion that the Green Revolution was a part of world history, not American history, was reinforced as, during comps, I turned to my primary US history list, where I didn't encounter the phrase Green Revolution a single time in the thousands and thousands of pages that I read. It seemed like, as in the domestic history of the United States, this phrase was almost entirely absent. However, in reading my US history field, I did notice one curious thing, that in fact, in US history, and particularly in US Southern history, there were actually a whole lot of Rockefeller reformers moving around. The Rockefeller philanthropies came up again and again in the historical scholarship, but nearly none of those scholars were connecting Rockefeller philanthropy in the US to the wider Green Revolution. As I learned, the very first iteration of Rockefeller agricultural philanthropy began in 1903, when John D. Rockefeller founded his very first vehicle for giving away money, the General Education Board. And from 1903 to 1914, so a whole generation before the Rockefeller Foundation went to Mexico, the GEB spent millions of dollars trying to transform the agricultural economy of the US South during the so-called progressive era in US history, hoping to raise the standard of living and ease the problem of poverty. They hired thousands of demonstration agents who fanned out across this region, hoping to convince farmers to take up new techniques and practices. Now, as a grad student, reading all these books and articles, I was a bit baffled to see these two scholarly topics so isolated from one another, right? Rockefeller agricultural reform in the US and Rockefeller agricultural reform in Mexico and then the wider world. It seemed as if the US historians of the GEB never linked that work to the global Green Revolution, And the Latin American and global food historians very rarely link the Green Revolution to the Rockefeller family's earliest work in the American South. So I wondered, why had these two strands not been crossed before? And as any entrepreneurial PhD student looking for a good dissertation project might do, I decided to jump onto this oversight. So trying to examine these two campaigns side by side and examining their influence upon one another became the topic of my doctoral dissertation, and then ultimately my first book, Agrarian Crossings, which was published in 2017. And in the time I've got left with you all, I want to share a brief overview of what I found in that journey, and also why I think it might be significant to the broader scholarship on the Green Revolution. I think that what I discovered in this research definitely undermines any simplistic view that the Green Revolution was a project of Americanization, as if there was one US model to be disseminated abroad, because in fact there were not one, but many regional models of US agriculture that the Rockefeller Foundation considered abroad. Likewise, I hope that my scholarship has tried to show that the Green Revolution was not solely a project born from US success and productivity, but in fact that it was born from US poverty and stagnation and efforts to try to overcome that. I also wonder whether the research that I've been involved in perhaps should make us question whether the Green Revolution is actually celebrating its 80th anniversary this year. Maybe it's actually celebrating its 120th anniversary if we date it back to 1903, when the first Rockefeller philanthropy begins in the United States. So what's the basic story that I discovered? Well, in 1903, John D. Rockefeller Sr. founds his very first philanthropic venture, the General Education Board, GEB, and endows it with a startup investment of $1 million, so much more money would flow into it later on. And despite this really anodyne and ambiguous name, the mission of the GEB was quite simple: to address the poverty of the American South. And it's really impossible to understand Rockefeller philanthropy without understanding their obsession with this one region. To them, these New York industrial capitalists, the South and its racial divisions, its highly skewed distribution of wealth, its denuded landscape, this seemed to represent the US's greatest problem at the time. In 1905, the GEB decides that agriculture was the fundamental obstacle to Southern prosperity, and they begin a nearly decade-long campaign to teach scientific methods, their words, to a diverse group of Black and white farmers. The GEB's agricultural work in the South was pretty contradictory because it had two competing goals. On one hand, it sought to teach poor cotton farmers how to grow corn so that they could attain self-sufficiency and improve their diets and avoid going into debt to feed themselves. But on the other hand, some Rockefeller planners believed that increasing cotton yields was actually the real key to regional prosperity. They believed that more cotton would mean more income, would mean a higher standard of living. And in fact, this tension between self-sufficiency versus an emphasis on cash crops would hardly be resolved in the early 20th century, but would of course continue to bedevil the Cold War era Green Revolution as well. Nevertheless, despite these internal contradictions, the GEB poured millions of dollars into its agricultural campaign, sending thousands of Rockefeller agents into rural southern counties in states like Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, to preach this gospel of improved agriculture for growing both corn and cotton. And in some ways, the campaign was quite successful, particularly in that it very much popularized farm demonstrations and extension. Helen just spoke about a few moments ago. And indeed, in 1914, the US federal government takes over the work of teaching new methods to farmers through the institutionalization of the Cooperative Extension Service, the so-called county agent system, in 1914. So in that sense, the GEB is successful. But on other hands, the GEB's campaign was a total failure. It had little impact in fostering self-sufficiency and undoing rural poverty. So in fact, when the US government takes over their agricultural work, the Rockefeller philanthropies begin to move away from agriculture, though they certainly didn't abandon their interest in the South. In fact, they, right after this, began a massive public health campaign within the South, waging war against hookworm and malaria. And in fact, when the Rockefeller Foundation as an institution is formally chartered in 1913, it was designed to take the public health lessons learned in the South and transplant them globally. Now, as I learned when I was studying for my comprehensive exams more than a decade ago, the Rockefeller Philanthropy's agricultural campaign in the South was rarely acknowledged by scholars as an inspiration or a model for that which followed in Mexico. Instead, in most versions that I read, what brought the Rockefeller Foundation into Mexican agriculture was this unexpected visit by US Vice President-elect Henry A. Wallace to Mexico City in 1940. Most scholars concluded that it was Wallace's visit and the subsequent pressure on the Rockefeller Foundation that paved the foundation's road to Mexico. Wallace is this very alluring, enigmatic, fascinating figure, so people were drawn to him. But in looking at the archival record, both in Mexico and in the United States, I actually discovered that Wallace played a pretty minor role in the Rockefeller Foundation's path toward Mexico. Much more important were two Southerners, both from North Carolina, who were veterans of the General Education Board's earliest campaigns, two guys by the name of John Farrell and Josephus Daniels. Farrell was a medical doctor who had worked in the Rockefeller public health world back since 1909, and Josephus Daniels was a journalist from North Carolina who had served as the US ambassador to Mexico from 1933 until 1942. They overlap in Mexico quite a bit, and throughout the 1930s, Daniels and Farrell lobbied the Rockefeller Foundation leadership to replicate the GEB's earlier agricultural work within Mexico. Now, initially, they found few sympathetic ears among the foundation's leaders. They got a lot of no's over the years, but the outbreak of World War II and the disruption of foundation programs in Asia and Europe finally brought a new interest in Latin America. Wallace's impromptu visit in December of 1940 also lent further momentum to this earlier proposal from Farrell and Daniels. But ultimately, it would be these two North Carolinians, not Wallace, who drew up the initial blueprints in 1941 for what a Rockefeller agricultural program in Mexico would look like. And that plan, in their view, emphasized the scientific improvement of agriculture, but it also remembered their experiences of the South, that questions of access, inequality, and social divisions among farmers have to be considered in Mexico too. Their formulation of a Mexican program was far less concerned with hunger, which was how the Green Revolution was often remembered later on, and far more so with stimulating even economic growth. So therefore, when the Rockefeller Foundation partnered with the Mexican Agriculture Secretariat in 1943, in that big moment, which we're commemorating the 80th of, right, the foundation of the Mexican Agricultural Program, or MAP, that project was born from explicit regional comparisons between the United States South and Mexico. And this was known to almost everybody involved. Even the Mexican Secretary of Agriculture, Marte Gomez, acknowledged that the Rockefellers were relying on earlier efforts to, quote, improve the conditions of life of the rural population of the southern states of the American Union. But it's not just US Southern inspirations that started the program. These comparisons also shaped the early years of operation. Several veterans of Southern reform led or consulted on the new Mexican agricultural program. People like Albert Mann, who served simultaneously as the head of the GEB and the head of the MAP. Then there was Paul Mangelsdorf, who was the key corn breeder overseeing the Mexican program, who'd previously worked in the cotton belt of East Texas. And Mangelsdorf relied again and again on his memories of the divided landscape of the US South when he planned his Mexican corn breeding program. And very often, these memories made him favor peasant-friendly solutions in Mexico. Right? He'd seen this divided landscape of planters and sharecroppers in Texas, and he believed that the foundation had to tailor their strategies in Mexico to the realities and limitations of campesino farmers in the Central Valley of Mexico. So what all this means is that a few years into the MAP's operation, in let's say 1945, 1946 or so, it was impossible to ignore that the Rockefeller program in Mexico was a direct outgrowth of the earlier philanthropic work in the US South. However, soon after, that memory would come to be forgotten, if not erased. As the Cold War loomed larger and the threat of communism terrified the Rockefeller leadership, they began to move away from peasant-friendly, anti-poverty programs and toward an effort to raise yields above all else. Of course, with the meteoric rise of Norman Borlaug as the sort of poster boy of the Green Revolution, an Iowa corn breeder who had little interest in either peasants or any experience in the US South, the Green Revolution would take a different shape. And by the 1950s and 1960s, the sort of glory years of the Green Revolution, at least in the global media, the US origins of the Rockefellers' agricultural work had been forgotten or erased. And I think that comes at great cost, because when we trace the Rockefeller philanthropy's long career in agricultural extension and development from the US South to Mexico, it upsets a lot of the assumptions we might have about the origins and meaning of US-led development projects abroad. What does it mean if development grew from the domestic laboratory of the US South, this internal periphery within the industrial core of the United States? I think it's really important that we acknowledge, too, that the Green Revolution is indeed part of US history, not some distant world history. And that in acknowledging this, we can push beyond neat binaries of global North versus global South, third world versus first world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, thanks, Tori. So what we're going to do now is turn toward a discussion. So I've got a couple of questions to start us off while people in the audience formulate their own questions. You can submit those in the Q&A. And Netza and Diana and Antonio will help me keep track of those. But I want to start with kind of where Tori just left off, actually, with a historiographic question. So one of the things that I really appreciate about this panel in particular is that we have three different historians who are historians of the United States in a certain sense, but also very much international in their research agendas. And that is intentional in the way that we've seen the sort of historiography of the Green Revolution transform over the past decade or so, as Tori started to describe there. I'm also interested in the panels, the very different themes, the different approaches to this process, this historical process that these various authors bring to the table, right? So with Amy, we're talking very specifically about capitalism and land and policy, right? And with Helen, we're talking about science and seeds and extension as sort of a vehicle of technology. And then in Tori's case, of course, with region and culture, right? And so I think that these are very different thematic angles at which we're sort of approaching and sort of together rewriting this process. So I guess my question then is a historiographic one, and it's considering sort of where the literature on the Green Revolution, or if we don't like that term as much, just more broadly agricultural development or modernization, sort of considering where that literature has gone in the past 10 years, I wonder how you think, what do you think have been some of the most noteworthy shifts? Like if you could identify, what have been those specific shifts within the United States, since that's the theme of this panel, and then outside of the United States, right? So I'm asking you to sort of put those two in tension. What similarities and differences do you see in the historiographic shifts of this process within and without the United States? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, what do you see, what remains to be done, right? Like what are the big areas you think have not really been treated in full yet? So a historiographic question, open to whoever wants to start.
Well, I'm happy to take a stab at just a couple of thoughts on this, and I really look forward to hearing what Helen and Tori have to say. I do think that there's, within US history, almost sort of two different things that I've seen going on. One is pulling the story back, both in the way that Tori does, but also pulling it back into the US colonization of the Philippines, and looking at kind of US imperial history as, in the same way that Tori was trying to overcome the kind of methodological nationalism that had framed US agricultural history as something totally separate from the Green Revolution's purported birth in Mexico. I think that another way that US historians have tried to kind of overcome that kind of methodological nationalism is by thinking about the very, very long history of US imperialism, and then asking how that relates to basically the, forms of US imperialism that characterize the Cold War context, where for the most part, it's not about colonialism. So that's one thing that I've seen happen. And then I think, the other transformation is attending to the some of the dynamics that have come up today. The fact that, number one, US advisors don't always, or necessarily even generally, go abroad to export what they've achieved at home. And when they do, they don't always have the ability to achieve that. And so just, thinking about imperialism in, I think in a way that isn't actually very new. I think that the idea of like kind of negotiated power, the idea of, multi-directional forms of power and exchange kind of go way back in the history of, the study of imperialism. But in this particular topic, I think it's been kind of a new and incredibly important and welcome contribution to the study of agriculture.
Well, I'll hop in as well. Regarding big milestones that I see as changing the field since the time that I was a grad student preparing for exams, right after I took my comps is when Nick Holother's The Hungry World came out, and I think it's a really important book because it convinced a lot of U.S. historians that the Green Revolution was important, that it was worth knowing about, and it really made it a household word among many scholars, not just of U.S. foreign policy, but of U.S. national history as well. And I think, Holother's book is important, but incomplete in many ways too, because it's a fairly traditional diplomatic history that really has the spotlight focused on U.S. policymakers and planners as they go around the world. But it was important in opening a conversation and attracting interest to the field in ways that the previous scholarship hadn't done as much, as I see it. And, in more recent years, I'm really moved by Gabriela Sotolaviaga's work on Mexican agronomists and their role in India in carrying what were supposedly U.S. technologies, seeds, and practices, but in fact we're deeply Mexican in many ways. Recentering the U.S. as not the sole node in the disseminating power of the Green Revolution, and that various competing perspectives among Mexican agricultural scientists would shape how they carry their work abroad, and took great pride in that, and saw it not as not as pawns of the U.S. whatsoever. Gabriela is still working on a book form of this, but she had a terrific article in the journal Agricultural History in the last few years that I strongly recommend. But so the bubbling up of research on this topic, on the multiple green revolutions, whether capitalized or not, since I was reading for exams 15 years ago, is really pretty staggering. Just the journal Agricultural History, they'd probably published a handful of articles on that topic before 2009, but in the 15 years since, there's been just article after article, and really, really great work too. But I think there are still some absences and silences that I'd love to see filled. I'd love to see a business history of the Green Revolution that traces the links between private corporations, whether it's Dow Chemical or Archer Daniels Midland or whatnot, with some of these key state or kind of philanthropic actors that so commonly are placed at center stage within the Green Revolution. Please tell me if someone's working on this. I haven't been as embroiled in this debate as I once was, but I think a really accessible and incisive study of how where the money was made in this project, instead of just focusing on philanthropy and government bureaucrats.
And I'll just jump on this sort of train of thought, thinking back to your first question there, Tim, in terms of what are the developments that have been kind of the historiographical developments that have that really stand out. And I really feel like the work that you and that Amy and Tori have done in showing especially the extent, and many others now, I think, of kind of negotiation, right, between actors situated in different places. And I think one of the reasons why that's so helpful right, to see the kind of back and forth and the ways in which ideas and tools and approaches are adapted, the ways they're sought and refused at different moments in time really helps, I think, to create a story that's moves away from the black and white sort of stark narratives that really structured, I think, the first understandings of the Green Revolution, even from 1970, as kind of good or bad. And I think it is in really recognizing and diving into that complexity in terms of whether it's in terms of motivations or in terms of outcomes, that we get to see and appreciate more of the gray. The gray of the Green Revolution, right? And because I think it's only from that perspective then it's possible to kind of move on to different kinds of solutions or approaches, because a lot of the questions that animated agricultural development work on the ground in the periods that we write about are things that still, are questions for development workers today. The Green Revolution is ongoing, right? And that's why some of this matters so much, or all of this matters so much. And in line with that, I think I definitely second Tori's call for the business history of the Green Revolution. I believe that it might be one of Corinne Unger's students was working on this, but maybe someone here in the room would be able to correct me and point us in the right direction. I feel like I've seen a PhD thesis on this. But there's certainly space for a lot of work there. And then I would say I've become more interested in thinking about critiques of the Green Revolution and how researchers and agencies responded to those, because we know that the first critiques of the Green Revolution came out as the Green Revolution was being declared to have happened, and the CGIAR institutes, or what became the CG institutes, were not deaf to those, right? There were developments in agricultural research and development practice that happened in response. And I think we're, to a certain extent, still so focused on, pushing back the story or kind of expanding this history around the 1970s and 80s. But actually, I think there's, the insights that we have from looking at those periods might inform really good historical scholarship about more recent agricultural development work that has actually taken on board some of that critical perspective and tried to grapple with it in meaningful ways.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna just sort of pause for a second if any of the other organizers have a question they'd like to ask, or if anyone wants to jump in the Q&A. Otherwise, I'll move on with my next question. But Diana.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for such inspiring presentations. With this panel, we have closed the thematic round of presentation of the seminar, and it has been very fortunate to discuss the role of the United States and Americanization for challenging the narratives of the Green Revolution. Regarding the narratives, I have a question for Helen. In what ways do you think that the analysis of the interaction between different generations can help us to think from a less linear angle about the past of the Green Revolution? I ask because that is one of the contributions I see in your approach to the Mosher's history. For as you yourself have underlined, the idea of modernization is not the same for the same actors, and therefore it's not the same for different generations either. Historiography has advanced, as you have incorporated, and also including a gender perspective. But I think that the interaction between generations can be another strategy to explore. And for Tor, I have a different question. What has been your experience teaching these subjects? What opinions do your students have about the possibility of making historiographical traditions of US and Latin American history interact? Language are for sure a challenge. And I ask this because I recognize a special vocation on your part for teaching, something fundamental to advance the understanding of the process linked to agrarian change, including the Green Revolution. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question, Diana. And I appreciate it especially because I think it's something I've struggled with, whether the very specific and small story that I told on the sort of research picture that I painted today, whether in a sense, whether it's worth telling, what can be drawn of looking at this generational shift and about this particular family. And one thing that I think about, which I didn't kind of expand on in the notes today, the father and son story, Martin Mother and Arthur Mosher, in a kind of fuller version of that, it would be possible to talk a bit more about the changes in American agriculture that happened between the early 20th century and the period of time in which Arthur Mosher leaves and then develops a kind of world for himself abroad. And it's telling that a major project of the second half of Martin Mosher's career is the documentation of the consolidation of farms in the Midwestern United States, and the departure of so much of the rural population of the United States for cities. And so the world that he helped structure was one in which his son didn't have an agricultural job that he could pursue in the region in which he grew up, right? Because agriculture had changed so profoundly. And the place where he could go and engage in a kind of agricultural work like that his father had done early in his career was indeed overseas, right? So the kind of model lifestyle that his father's career provided for him was one that was no longer an option in many ways. And so I think that's one potential lesson, is really thinking about the longer timelines of agricultural change and how they structure individual choices, and how they may be structured the choices of a generation of folks interested in agriculture who had to look for other horizons for their sort of interests or skill sets. One thought I have, but I'd be grateful for others' thoughts as well.
Diana, thank you very much for your question about teaching as well, because one of the most important parts of my job is to make this stuff accessible and meaningful to 19-year-old US undergraduates, and it's not always an easy thing to do. And the class in which I most often teach about my own research is this class I've created, and pardon the title, it's a little silly, but it draws a lot of students in. It's called Borders, Burritos, and Gringos, the Entangled Histories of the US and Mexico. And in that class, I try to show that you cannot understand US history without understanding Mexican history, and vice versa, right? And we start from the very beginning. The bulk of the class is really an attempt to try to show to US students that Mexico and the US have a tremendous amount in common, that they share great parallels in their histories. I mean, on the very first day, the students learn, did you guys know that Mexico is also a United States, right? It is a bunch of states that have come together, Estados Unidos Mexicanos, that is very new to them. And we often talk about things that traditionally that are taught as ways to show difference between the US and Mexico. Like, in a Latin American history class, you might learn about caudillos, about these kind of big men on horseback, and how they take control of Latin American history. And well, we don't have that in the US. We have these sober statesmen who sit and write policy. And well, the reality is that US history has lots of caudillos. I mean, Andrew Jackson in the 1830s and 1820s and 30s is a classic Latin American caudillo, though he's very rarely called one. So even before we get to the 1930s and 1940s, when my own research is on, the students have been primed to think about the parallels and similarities between these two countries. And I do find that it's interesting. Most of my students are from the US South, from Tennessee or from other states in this region. And of course, that's a region with a deep and painful and complicated history, a history of defeat, of poverty, of sort of marginalization. And I think this provides some sort of sympathy for Mexico in some ways, right? That in the US-Mexican relationship, there's been similar parallels to that. And it allows them to kind of, understand Mexican perspectives of living in the shadow of this northern giant. I mean, in the sense, the US South has done that too, though very often in partnership with it. I mean, same is true of Mexico in certain ways. So these are fun things to teach, but you have to work your way up to them, I would say.
Thanks. There's a couple of questions in the chat, one for Tori and one for Amy. I'll read both of them right now, just so that you can each be thinking about these. For Tori, could you tell us more about how the idea of Americanization involves not only US foreign policy, but also the reinvention of what America understands of itself? So I think that actually goes quite nicely with what you were just talking about students from the US South, their image of themselves. And then for Amy, what is the influence, if any, of CIAT and agriculture policies in Colombia? And I think maybe even broadening that out for Helen, of CGIAR as a sort of, player in international agricultural development emergent from these Green Revolution processes. So what's the influence of those particular centers in these Green Revolution spots?
Well, I'll jump in quickly to Jaime's really fascinating and big ranging question. I think it very much gets at, I think there's a stereotype both within the US and beyond that the parts of the US that are most globally influential are Hollywood, Wall Street, and Washington, D.C., right? That these coastal cities are the ones that primarily shape the United States' engagement with the larger world. And of course, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that's true. But there's also the reality that rural people, rural places from so-called flyover country, right, from the rural interior of the United States, have also had a tremendous impact on shaping U.S. foreign policy and pop cultural imports and exports as well. I mean, just look at who the U.S. policymakers are in key positions during, let's say, the Cold War era. Many of them are not from those coastal hubs, but are from the rural South and the Midwest too, who bring their own sort of strange backgrounds into engaging with the world. And I've been thinking about this a great deal too in my the other book project I'm working on, which is about American country music, which is of course rarely associated with coastal cities, even though there's a lot of fans there too. But how the United States comes to win millions of fans of this genre that's seemingly very distinct from the kind of coastal experience in the U.S. And that many people, when they think of the United States, they think about Texas or Tennessee in Southeast Asia or West Africa, which is not how many many Americans understand. They understand, oh, well, it's the New Yorkers and the San Franciscans that are changing the world, while Tennessee and Iowa are not doing so. But in reality, of course, that's not true.
Let me just say two quick things. First is that what's funny is that I think I have more to say to the first question than the second question, and I would be happy to sort of follow up on Tori's comments there. But in relation to the question from Jose Antonio, thank you so much for that question. And in all honesty, I just need to turn this question over to Tim, who literally wrote the book on this subject. So rather than try and summarize your book and ventriloquize here, Tim, I just want to kind of give you a chance to discuss that question.
Well, why don't I pass for now and just have you follow up on Tori's comments about Americanization?
Yeah, I mean, my own research, part of the reason that I'm a little bit of an outlier on this panel is that I actually didn't do any research on agriculture in the United States. But there is in my work very much, I think, an echo of what Tori is discussing about, and I think just an echo of the way that we understand empire and the way that post-colonial studies has kind of shaped our comprehension of history, in the sense that I very much understand attempts to remake other societies as initiatives that remake the metropole as well. And so one of the things that I think is a little bit unusual about my work is that I don't look at one particular area of policy like land reform and agricultural reform and look at the exchanges that happen there. I think kind of Tori has written the book on that. But my work looks at other forms of exchange that often kind of leap across conventional boundaries of intellectual life and policymaking. So for instance, when I look at the legacies of US involvement in the construction of the CBC, this agency that goes on to implement land reform in the Cauca Valley, I do find that actually that history has consequences in the United States, but they're found actually outside the realm of agricultural reform and regional development policy, because because of sort of temporally what's going on. In the 1960s, when the CBC is doing this work, in the United States, they're not trying to do agrarian reform anymore. Nobody's looking for lessons on that subject. It's the period where they think they've got lessons for other people. But the United States is embroiled in all kinds of other conflicts in the 1960s that have to do with, trying to launch a war on poverty, trying to deal with the Black freedom struggle and all of the questions it's putting on the table. And so what I find is that actually there's a constant adaptation of lessons from Latin America that's being applied to oftentimes a slightly different set of questions. And the key lesson that I find Americans who were involved in the CBC drawing is they are themselves businessmen who went down to Colombia and allied themselves with other businessmen there to implement reform policies. And they come home saying, actually, the lesson of development is that capital should basically be the instrument through which social reform happens. And they start to insert new forms of for-profit contracting into the US welfare state in areas like job training and education, areas that on the face of it seem to have nothing to do with agrarian reform. So anyway, I just completely agree with the spirit of your question that any attempt at Americanization abroad has effects back home. And I think one of the things that we can do as historians is be attentive to what are often extremely wide-ranging consequences that they have back home that spill over beyond the limits of the particular area of policy that they went abroad to participate in.
And Tim, are you going to follow up on CIAT, and then I can?
No, I'm not. You go ahead.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the expansion of that question about CIAT out to be thinking about the CG institutes, of which CIAT is currently, well, in its new formation as the Alliance of CIAT and Biodiversity, a representative in Colombia, basically institution in Colombia. And I see the influence of the establishment of these centers as the sort of beating hearts of the Green Revolution and its continuation. There's probably many ways to parse this question, but one is thinking about a vision of agricultural development through research, and specifically a kind of focus and emphasis on scientific excellence, the idea that it is, development concerns can be resolved through work that is also publishable in journal articles, right? And for which one can also receive scientific recognition. This came up a number of times in the book that Tim and I are editing, in different contributions on how these centers have shaped work over time, or what forces have shaped them. And it's really, it's a really something to really stop and question and consider, right? The ways in which those two aims are profoundly not aligned in terms of outcomes. And then I think the other thing that again comes up in cutting across these different CG institutions is by necessity of attempting to be a kind of globally encompassing or at least significantly globally encompassing institutions, the identification of broad regions of general kind of problems, and defining problems at the scale of arid regions, or at the scale of the semi-arid tropics, right? And trying to define things that might be solutions across, wide areas, irrespective of political circumstances or social circumstances, tools that would be generalizable. And I think thinking about the generalizable tool is in part trying to identify how the scale was set, right? And part of the setting of scale had to do with founding institutions in particular places, right? That would really then kind of speak to a particular generalized region or generalized problem, and consequently also ignore what was potentially on the ground right around them. And this is something that your work on Columbia, Tim, really speaks to very well.
Thanks. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So because this is the last thematic panel before the concluding session in October, I want to just conclude with a sort of a lightning round. And I'll go in the order that we started. So Amy, Helen, and then Tori. But I want to return to Tori's anecdote about studying for comps. And because this is the concluding thematic panel, I want to make this another historiographic type question, right? So the literature on these themes, and broadly speaking, right, for Amy, right, capitalism and international development, all of these types of, these related themes, the literature has changed significantly since when any of you were starting your PhD dissertations and reading for comps, right? So if a beginning graduate student comes into your office tomorrow and says that they want to work on the Green Revolution and they're all excited about this thing they just heard about, what advice do you give them?
That's great. A great question. And I guess let me say that in some ways, I would advise them to do exactly what Tori did actually when he was in graduate school, because I actually still think that some of the best literature that we have on this subject is still written in national frames, and it's not written as histories of the Green Revolution. And so the same kind of like following your nose that Tori did, reading in national historiographies and sort of finding conversations that haven't actually happened is still, I think, what graduate students need to do. So I think, for instance, of the fact that the literature on agrarian reform, for instance, in Latin America continues to grow in size and complexity, examining, there's a million things. It's developed over time from, there was a generation that introduced the study of gender to it. And then there was, environmental historians and so on. And in a sense, I think that, the study of agriculture still needs to be based in, some of those kind of core literatures. Often they were oriented not to explaining the Green Revolution, but to explaining the nature of social revolution, let's say, and many other topics. So in some ways, I kind of think that any student who wants to study these sorts of transnational questions does need to sink down into national historiographies. Obviously today, just listening to the work that, is on display here, there is that, now kind of pretty substantial literature that it was designed to be transnational from the start. And I maybe I'm not the best person to comment on it because my book is part of it. But I guess I really encourage students to go back and read old books and books that weren't written exactly to answer their question, because they need to know what's out there and not be disparaging actually towards the literature that preceded the kind of transnational turn. And they also need to know who they're going to be talking to. If you are going to go and work in Colombian history, Mexican history, you need to be able to engage respectfully with the people who have done groundbreaking work there and be taken seriously yourself.
Obviously, I agree with all of that. Excellent advice. And I think thinking in terms of where you want to be situated in telling a history of the Green Revolution would be the first place that I would start, for all the reasons that Amy has outlined. But then I think another point that I would make, or question that I would have for the student, goes back to something that you pointed out, Tim, in terms of the different lenses that, for example, Amy, Tori, and I all brought to the conversation today, right? And you broke it down as histories of capitalism and policy, histories of seed science and technology, histories of region versus culture, right? Because I think that, there is this question of, when we study the Green Revolution, what are we interested in, right? Like, what are the changes that any given history fronts as like the most significant? Because the term has come to be so encompassing. It can actually be quite a lot of different things that are the things we take to be meaningful in understanding a particular moment or in understanding a particular place, right? And so, it's a question of, well, what is the Green Revolution to you? And what do you think is significant about it? And then, constructing a sort of angle or approach or something from there, because we have to recognize that it is not a single thing or a single moment, and it didn't happen in only a sort of subset of places, but in fact, yeah, we use the phrase rather loosely now, and it has been kind of used influentially, and that's why we have to take that seriously.
Well, Amy, thank you very much for invoking my own graduate school self as a exemplar. Though in the spirit of that, I'm going to give my advice the complete opposite of what I actually did as a dissertating student, which is that I went to the Rockefeller Archive Center first. And my advice is, do not go to the Rockefeller Archive Center first. It is not the only home of records about the Green Revolution. And in fact, it needs to be seriously de-emphasized in its importance. And so the Rockefeller Archive Center is this unique private archive in just outside of New York City. And they have a lot of resources. The name Rockefeller still carries some money with it. I mean, they're still an archive, so they're kind of broke compared to other things. But they have funds, they have grants, they serve you free lunch on Tuesdays, or at least they did when I was there. They'll pick you up at the train station. They're a really, well-endowed archival institution. And because of that, that money behind it has over-amplified the importance of the Rockefeller Foundation in general and earlier philanthropies within the historiography, right? Because people just go there because it's a cushy, nice, comfy place to do research. They've got great archivists that'll work with you individually. And of course, a lot of the papers that are held there are very important, but there are so many other important collections, especially not in English, that are located elsewhere. So de-emphasize the Rockefeller Archive Center. And then the second bit of advice I would give is to get out a shovel and dig it to the earth and start a garden, because you can't really write about agriculture unless you try to grow something yourself. You don't understand what it's about.
Great advice from all of you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn things back over to Netza and Diana if you have any concluding remarks, but let me just say again, thank you to our panelists today, Amy Offner, Helen Curry, and Tori Olsson.
Diana, if you want to say something.
I just want to say thank you for joining us and to let us learning about your research. I think that we have some very good ideas to extend our own research and also our teaching process. And of course, you are invited to the last session that could be conference provided by Wilson Picado next month.
Well, that's all. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Tori. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Timothy, for being here today, and to all of attendants. And well, we will see all of you, next month for the closing conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. See you.